The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, no slow poetry of falling leaves and crisping air. It was a sudden, violent arrival, a declaration of war from the sky. The cold did not knock before it entered. It shattered the lock and kicked in the door. It was a physical presence, an invisible predator that hunted the spaces between logs, the cracks beneath doors, and the very marrow in a man's bones. In the small, hopeful settlement of Providence Bluffs, the settlers felt it as a personal insult, a betrayal by a land that had promised them so much under the summer sun. Their cabins, built with the honest sweat of their first year, were proving to be little more than wooden sieves. They were constructed according to the trusted wisdom of the East, the same designs that had served their fathers and their fathers' fathers. A square room, a sleeping loft, and at its heart, a great stone fireplace with a wide, hungry mouth. This was the altar to which they made their daily sacrifice of cordwood, feeding it split oak and pine in a desperate plea for warmth. But the altar was greedy and gave back little. The fire roared, a brilliant, beautiful beast, but its heat shot straight up the chimney, a fleeting gift to the indifferent stars. 10 feet from the hearth, the warmth was a memory. 15 feet, it was a cruel joke. Frost bloomed on the inside of the walls, delicate, deadly flowers of ice that crept across the rough-hewn planks. Drafts moved through the cabins like thieves in the night, stealing what little comfort the fire provided. The wind howled a constant, mournful song, pressing against the structures with the weight of a glacier. Families huddled together under piles of quilts and animal hides, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. The settlement was a collection of tiny, flickering candles in a vast, encroaching darkness, and each family feared their candle would be the next to go out. They were burning through their woodpiles at a terrifying rate. A cord that was meant to last a month was gone in a week. The sound of axes striking frozen wood was the town's grim heartbeat, a constant rhythm of desperation. Men returned from the woodlots with their beards frozen solid, their faces masks of red, chapped skin, their spirits worn as thin as their worn-out coats. They would stack the wood, feed the fire, and watch the heat vanish into the sky. It was a cycle of futility, a labor that produced only exhaustion and the gnawing anxiety of a dwindling supply. They had followed the rules, they had built as they were taught, and it was not enough. The cold was winning. Among them lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, having lost her husband to a fever on the journey west the year before. She was quiet, observant, and possessed a stillness that the other settlers mistook for frailty or grief-induced detachment. She had 2 small children, a boy of 8 named Samuel, and a girl of 5 named Clara. They were the center of her world, the twin flames she was determined to shield from the encroaching winter. The community regarded her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She did not work like the other women, did not join the circles of gossip or quilting. She spent her evenings not mending clothes, but poring over a collection of books her husband had left behind. Heavy, leather-bound volumes filled with strange diagrams of gears, aqueducts, and furnaces from other lands and other times. While the men of Providence Bluffs doubled their efforts, chopping more wood and stuffing more moss into the chinking of their cabins, Ilara did something strange. She took a stick and began to draw in the frozen dirt beside her half-finished cabin. She did not draw a square. She drew a rectangle, longer and narrower than the others, and inside it she drew a labyrinth, a winding, serpentine path that started in the center and coiled its way back and forth before reaching an outer wall. It was a pattern that made no sense to anyone who stopped to look. The idea had come to her from one of her husband's books, a dusty tome on the engineering of the Roman Empire, cross-referenced with another on Eastern European masonry. It was a concept that defied every principle of fireplace construction they knew. The local wisdom was simple. A fire needs to breathe. Give it a big hearth to draw in the air and a wide chimney to let out the smoke, quick and dirty. Her idea was the opposite. It was slow. It was complicated. It was a plan to build not just a fireplace, but a heart of stone and clay for the house itself. A heart that would hold the heat, not release it. She called it a masonry heater, but the men who saw her drawings gave it another name. They called it the floor fireplace. Silas Croft, the town's most respected builder, was the first to openly mock her. He was a large man, confident and loud, his hands as calloused as old leather. He had built nearly every cabin in the settlement, and he took her strange design as a personal affront. He stood over her drawings, his arms crossed over his broad chest, a smirk playing on his lips. "Woman," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear, "smoke goes up. It has since the first man lit a fire. You mean to trap it under your floor? You'll choke your children in their sleep, or burn the house down from the roots." His laughter was the spark that lit the fire of community ridicule. Others joined in. "She's building a tomb, not a home," one man chuckled to his neighbor. "The widow's folly," another named it, and the name stuck. The women would watch her from their own cold cabins, shaking their heads. "Poor thing, her grief has addled her mind," they whispered, trying to reinvent the flame itself. The warnings were constant and delivered with the condescending certainty of the ignorant. They told her she was wasting time. They told her the ground was too frozen to dig. They told her she was a fool to trust the scribbles in a book over the hard-won experience of men who knew this land. Elara listened to it all with her characteristic quiet. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply nodded, her gaze calm and unwavering, and returned to her work. Their words were just another part of the wind, another cold sound in a world full of them. She had her books, she had her measurements, and most importantly, she had the image of her children's shivering forms in her mind. That was a motivation far stronger than the derision of her neighbors. Her husband had been an engineer, a man who believed that problems were not obstacles, but puzzles waiting for a solution. "Nature has rules, Elara," he used to say, tapping a diagram in one of his books. "Respect the rules, and she will work for you. Defy them, and she will break you." The settlers were defying the rules of thermal dynamics. She intended to respect them. And so, the work began. It was a lonely and arduous task. The ground was as hard as iron, and breaking it required a monumental effort. She used a heavy pickaxe, swinging it with a steady, metronomic rhythm that belied her slender frame. Each strike sent a painful jolt up her arms. The frozen earth yielded only inches at a time, stubborn and unforgiving. While other families were already settled into their cabins, resigned to their losing battle with the cold, Elara was still on the outside, digging trenches inside the footprint of her foundation. Her son Samuel helped where he could, clearing the loosened, icy dirt with a small shovel, his face set with a seriousness far beyond his years. The men of the settlement would walk by on their way to the woodlot, pausing to watch the strange scene. They saw a woman and a boy digging a maze in the frozen ground, and they shook their heads. Silas Croft was particularly vocal. "Look at her," he'd say to his companions, a note of pity mixed with his scorn. "Finishing a foundation when the snow is already knee-deep. Her children will be ice statues before she ever gets a roof over their heads." His crew had finished their last cabin weeks ago, a fine, sturdy structure built the proper way. It was cold, of course, but it was finished. Elara's slow, deliberate process seemed like a madness born of desperation. She ignored them. Her focus was absolute. She was not just digging, she was sculpting. The trenches had to be precise. the depth uniform, the curves gentle, to allow for the smooth passage of air. This was the foundation of her entire idea, the hidden lungs of the house. Once the channels were dug, she began lining them with flat stones she had gathered from the riverbed during the late autumn, carrying them one by one until she had a great pile. Each stone was chosen for its size and lack of cracks. She fit them together like a puzzle, using a mortar she made herself from clay, sand, and wood ash. It was a slow, chilling process. Her fingers, even wrapped in cloth, grew numb from handling the freezing stones and the wet clay. While Ilara carefully laid her stone channels, the rest of Providence Bluffs continued their winter rituals. The days were a frantic cycle of chopping, hauling, and burning. The nights were a shivering vigil, a constant battle against the encroaching frost. The interior of their cabins became a landscape of extremes. A small bubble of scorching heat existed within 5 feet of the fireplace, while the rest of the room remained in a state of perpetual deep freeze. Water buckets froze solid overnight. Bread left on a table turned to stone. The settlers were living like campers, their entire existence shrunk to the small circle of light and heat cast by their inefficient fires. They were prisoners in the very homes they had built to protect them. Ilara's design was meant to break this cycle. The innovation was not in the fire itself, but in what happened after. She explained it once, patiently, to Samuel, as they laid the capstones over the underfloor channels. "The fire in a normal hearth is like a shouting man," she said, her voice soft. "He spends all his energy in one great burst, and then his voice is gone. Most of what he says is lost to the wind. This fire," she gestured to the complex structure of brick and clay she was now building in the center of the cabin, "will be different. It will be like a storyteller. It will burn hot and fast, for only a short time, telling its whole story at once. But the story, the heat, won't escape. It will be caught by the stone." She pointed to the channels under their feet. "The hot smoke, the breath of the story, will travel through these paths first. It will walk all around the room, under the floor, warming the stones as it goes. Then," she pointed to the massive, thick-walled masonry column that was rising in the cabin's center, "it will rise up through another maze inside this bell, giving up the rest of its warmth to the clay bricks." She tapped the outer wall of the structure. "By the time the smoke finally leaves the chimney, it will be cool. It will have nothing left to give. All its warmth, all its energy, will be stored right here, in this mass of stone and clay, and this mass will breathe that warmth back into the room all day and all night." It was a system of thermal mass, a simple principle of physics that felt like magic to those who did not understand it. The central structure was a complex firebox, combustion chamber, and a series of baffles designed to extract every last calorie of heat from the wood. It required a different kind of fire, small, intensely hot, and brief. It was the antithesis of the constantly fed, lazy orange flames in her neighbors' hearths. Her children watched in fascination as the structure grew, a strange, monolithic altar of clay and stone that dominated their small home. It was not beautiful in the traditional sense. It was bulky, primitive, and enormous. But Ilara knew its beauty was not in its form, but in its function. It was a promise of survival. By the time she finally laid the roof beams, the first great blizzard had already passed, leaving the settlement buried under 3 feet of snow. Her cabin was the last to be finished, a fact that her neighbors noted with grim satisfaction. They saw her late completion as proof of her folly. But as they shivered in their own homes, feeding their roaring fires, Ilara was conducting the first firing of her masonry heater. It was a delicate process of slowly curing the clay mortar to prevent cracking. For days, she burned small, controlled fires, gradually increasing their intensity. The outside of the great mass remained cool to the touch. Silas Croft, passing by and seeing no smoke from her chimney, assumed her contraption had already failed. "She's likely frozen in there," he remarked to a companion. "A tragic end to a foolish endeavor." Then came the week the old-timers would later call the White Death. It was not a storm in the conventional sense. It was a siege. The sky, which had been a hard, clear blue, turned a milky, opaque white. The temperature, already brutally low, plummeted into a realm of cold that had no name. It was a cold that killed exposed skin in minutes. A cold that made trees crack open with a sound like a rifle shot. A cold that froze the very air. And with the cold came the wind. It was not a gusting wind, but a solid, unending river of force that screamed out of the north. It picked up the fallen snow and turned the world into a churning, blinding vortex of white. For the settlers of Providence Bluffs, the siege was a nightmare. Their cabins, which had been merely uncomfortable, became death traps. The wind forced its way through every crack, every seam, no matter how well chinked. It was a physical assault, a relentless pressure that seemed intent on dismantling their homes, log by log. The sound was a constant, shrieking madness that frayed the nerves and stole all hope. Inside, their great fireplaces became their enemies. The powerful draw of the wind up the wide chimneys created a vacuum effect, sucking the precious warm air out of the cabins and pulling in more of the Arctic cold through the walls. To stay warm, they had to burn wood at a suicidal pace. In Silas Croft's cabin, the situation was desperate. He had a wife and 4 children, and they were all huddled around the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The fire was a roaring inferno, consuming logs as thick as a man's thigh in under an hour. Yet the heat barely reached them. The draft from the floor was like an icy river, and the back wall of the cabin was a solid sheet of ice. Silas worked like a man possessed, moving from the woodpile outside to the fireplace inside, a human shuttle feeding a monster. He could feel the life of his family, measured in the shrinking size of his woodpile. He had started the week with 2 full cords. By the 3rd day of the storm, he was down to his last few armfuls. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. He was not alone. All through the settlement, the same story was unfolding. The frantic rhythm of feeding the fire, the dwindling woodpiles, the creeping, insidious cold. One family began burning a broken chair. Another chopped up their wooden bedsteads. They were tearing apart their homes to fuel the very fires that were failing to keep them warm. The community, once bound by shared hope, was now a collection of isolated, freezing islands, each fighting a losing battle. The promises of the land seemed like a distant, mocking lie. They were small, fragile creatures, and the world had turned into a white, howling wolf determined to devour them. But in Alara's cabin, the world was different. When the great storm hit, she had already been living with her new system for a week. She had fired the heater that morning, a small bundle of wood that burned hot and fast for just over an hour. Then she had closed the flue damper, trapping the heat inside the masonry. Now there was no fire, there was no smoke. There was only a deep, profound, and utterly miraculous warmth. The massive clay and stone structure in the center of the room radiated a gentle, even heat that filled the entire space. The floor, warmed by the channels beneath it, was comfortable to the touch. The wind shrieked outside, a wild beast trying to claw its way in, but inside the cabin the air was still and calm. There were no drafts, because the sealed heater was not sucking air up a chimney. The temperature was a steady 65 degrees, from corner to corner, from floor to ceiling. Her children were not huddled by a fire. Samuel was on the floor, reading one of his father's books. Little Clara was playing with her corn husk dolls. They were in their shirt sleeves. Ilara sat at her small table, mending a tear in Samuel's trousers, her movements calm and unhurried. The sound of the storm was a distant thing, a drama happening in another world. Her cabin was not a fortress against the winter. It was an island of spring. Her vast woodpile, the one her neighbors had pitied her for not using, sat outside, almost entirely untouched. The contrast was absolute. In Silas's cabin there was frantic energy, a roaring, hungry fire, and a bone-deep, terrifying cold. There was the constant, exhausting labor of feeding the beast. In Ilara's cabin there was stillness, silence, and a pervasive, gentle warmth. There was no labor, only the quiet hum of a system working in perfect harmony with the laws of nature. One home was a scene of desperate survival, a family clinging to a precipice. The other was a scene of peaceful domesticity, a family living in comfort and safety. One was a testament to the failure of blind tradition. The other was a testament to the triumph of quiet ingenuity. On the fourth day of the storm, Silas Croft burned his last log. The roaring fire shrank to a bed of glowing coals, and the oppressive cold, which had been held at bay in one small corner of the room, immediately surged forward to claim the entire cabin. Within minutes, the temperature plunged. The ice on the walls seemed to thicken before his eyes. His youngest child began to cry, a thin, weak sound that terrified him more than the howling of the wind. He looked at his wife, her face pale and her lips blue. He looked at his children, shivering uncontrollably under the blankets. He was the master builder, the man who had sheltered this entire community, and he had failed. His pride, which had been a great, roaring fire itself, died with the last of the embers. All that was left was the cold, hard ash of fear. He had to do something. He could not let his family freeze. He thought of the other cabins, but he knew they were all in the same desperate state. There was no help to be found there. Then an image came to him. The quiet widow, Ilara, and her strange, foolish fireplace. He had mocked her, had led the chorus of ridicule. He had predicted she would be the first to perish. The irony was a bitter pill. But what if she wasn't? What if, by some impossible chance, her madness had worked? It was a desperate, foolish hope, but it was the only one he had left. Leaving his family huddled together for warmth, he pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in a scarf, and stepped out into the blinding, screaming fury of the storm. The journey to Ilara's cabin, a distance of no more than 200 yards, was a brutal ordeal. The wind tore at him like a pack of wolves, and the snow was so thick he could barely see his own feet. He navigated by memory, his body bent double against the gale. He expected to find her cabin dark and silent, a tomb of ice, a monument to her folly. He steeled himself for the grim task of digging out her frozen body and those of her children. But as he drew closer, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A soft, yellow light glowed in her window, and from her chimney there was no smoke, not a wisp. The sight made no sense. A light meant life, but no smoke meant no fire, and no fire meant death. He stumbled the last few feet to her door, his mind reeling with confusion. He raised a frozen, numb fist and pounded on the heavy wood. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He pounded again, harder this time, shouting her name. For a long moment there was no answer. He was about to turn away, his last hope extinguished, when he heard the sound of a bar being lifted from inside. The door swung open, and Ilara stood there, bathed in the warm light of a lantern. The first thing that hit Silas was the warmth. It was not a blast of dry, scorching heat like the air from his own fireplace. It was a wave of calm, gentle, humid warmth that flowed out of the cabin and enveloped him. It felt like stepping into a different season. It was the most shocking and miraculous sensation of his life. He stared, dumbfounded. Ilara was wearing a simple dress, her sleeves rolled up. Behind her, in the soft lantern light, he saw her son reading a book on the floor. Her daughter was asleep in a small bed, covered by a single, light quilt. There was no fire. The monstrous clay structure in the center of the room was dark and silent. But the air was warm. The entire cabin was warm. He looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked past her, at the impossible scene of domestic peace in the heart of the White Death. He looked down at his own boots and saw the snow that had caked onto them was already beginning to melt, forming small puddles on her warm wooden floor. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The cold had stolen his voice, but it was his shattered pride that kept him silent. All his certainty, all his experience, all his loud and confident pronouncements, they had all been wrong. He was the fool. He had built houses of cold, while this quiet woman, with her books and her strange drawings, had built a house of warmth. Ilara did not gloat. There was no trace of triumph in her eyes, only a calm, patient understanding. She saw the desperation on his face, the rime of ice in his beard, the utter defeat in his posture. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his mockery. She simply stepped aside. "Come in, Silas," she said, her voice even and soft. "There is room." He stumbled inside, bringing the biting cold with him, and she closed the door, shutting out the storm. He stood there, dripping on her floor, a monument to failed tradition. He had come expecting to be a savior or a pallbearer. Instead, he was a beggar, seeking sanctuary in the very house he had condemned. He was wrong. It was the most profound and humbling realization of his life. Silas, without another word, turned and plunged back into the storm. A few minutes later, he returned, shepherding his wife and children before him. They entered Ilara's cabin like refugees from a war zone, their faces etched with fear and cold. The moment they crossed the threshold, their expressions changed. Their shivering bodies registered the impossible warmth. Their eyes widened in the same disbelief that had struck Silas. Ilara met them with blankets, not for warmth, but to dry them off. She gave them hot broth, which she had kept warm on the surface of the masonry heater. Not one of them could comprehend what they were seeing, a home without a fire, yet warmer than any they had ever known. Word travels strangely in a crisis. Perhaps it was a brief lull in the wind, or a desperate shout carried from one buried cabin to another. Silas, his own family safe, felt a responsibility for the others. He fought his way to his nearest neighbor's cabin, his message simple and urgent. "Go to the widow's house. There is warmth there." The message was passed along, a chain of desperate hope through the frozen settlement. Soon, another family appeared at Ilara's door, then another. They came in ones and twos, beaten and humbled by the storm. Each one entered with the same look of stunned amazement. The cabin, which was small by any measure, began to fill. Ilara took them all in. She organized the space, making pallets on the warm floor for the children. Her small home became a sanctuary, an ark of warmth in a frozen, drowning world. The most remarkable thing was the silence. After the initial gasps of disbelief, a quiet reverence fell over the room. The men, who had laughed at her, now sat on her floor, their heads bowed, unable to meet her gaze. The women, who had pitied her, now watched her with expressions of awe. They were all witnesses to a miracle, and the author of that miracle was the very person they had dismissed as a fool. The laughter of the community had been replaced by the quiet respect of the humbled. When the storm finally broke after 6 long days, Providence Bluffs was a changed place. The world was scoured and white, buried under monumental drifts of snow. But the more profound change was in the hearts of its people. As they emerged from Elara's cabin, blinking in the bright, cold sunlight, they saw their own homes not as shelters, but as failures. The great test had come, and they had all been found wanting, all except one. A few days later, after the town had begun to dig itself out, Silas Croft returned to Elara's cabin. He did not come for shelter this time. He knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he stood before her, hat in hand, his gaze steady and direct. He was no longer the proud, arrogant builder. He was a student. "Elara," he said, and his voice was low and heavy with humility. "I was wrong. I was a fool, and my pride nearly cost me my family. That thing you built," he gestured toward the heater, "it's not folly. It's wisdom. The deepest kind. I am asking you, teach me. Teach us all." Elara led him inside. She did not deliver a lecture or demand an apology. She simply cleared the small wooden table and laid out her husband's books. She opened them to the diagrams of Roman hypocausts and Russian stoves. With a piece of charcoal, she began to draw on a piece of scrap lumber, explaining the principles of thermal mass, of heat exchange, of the complete combustion that left almost no soot. She spoke of how a slow release of energy was more powerful than a sudden, violent one. She shared her knowledge as freely and as generously as she had shared her warmth, holding nothing back. Silas, the master builder, sat and listened, his face a mask of intense concentration, absorbing every word. He had spent his life working with his hands. For the first time, he was learning to work with his head. That spring, the sound of hammering in Providence Bluffs was accompanied by the new sounds of digging and stone setting. The community did not just rebuild, they remade. Led by Silas, who was now Elara's most dedicated and meticulous student, they began to construct new homes and retrofit old ones based on her design. They laid foundations with winding stone channels. They built massive, heat-storing cores of clay and brick. The work was slow, difficult, and required a patience they had never before possessed. But they did not complain. They had learned a hard lesson in the White Death, a lesson written in frost and fear. They were no longer just building cabins. They were building hearts for their homes. The physical landscape of the settlement began to change. The new cabins looked different, often longer, with a thick, powerful chimney rising from the center rather than the end. Inside, they were dominated by the great masonry heaters, each one built with a combination of shared knowledge and individual craftsmanship. The Widow's Folly became the Providence Hearth, and the town that had once mocked its inventor now revered her. Elara was no longer the strange, detached outsider. She was the quiet, respected center of their community, the source of the wisdom that had saved them. The story of what had happened in Providence Bluffs traveled with the snowmelt. Traders and trappers who passed through the following winter were astonished. They walked into cabins during a blizzard and found families living in a comfortable, even warmth, using a fraction of the wood of other settlements. They heard the story of the great storm and the widow who had tamed the cold. They asked for drawings, for explanations. The idea spread, carried by word of mouth from one valley to the next. The Providence Hearth began to appear in other territories, a quiet revolution in survival, a testament to an idea that had been born in a book and proven in a blizzard. Years later, when the settlement had grown into a proper town, with a church and a general store, the children who had survived the White Death would tell the story to their own children. They spoke of the terrible cold and the screaming wind, but they always ended the story the same way. They spoke of a small, warm cabin, a refuge filled with their neighbors. They spoke of a quiet woman who met pride with patience and ignorance with grace. The legacy she built was not made of stone or clay. It was built from a more profound material. It was the understanding that true wisdom rarely shouts. It proves itself, quietly and certainly, in the face of the storm. And it was the lesson that the most important thing you can build is not a wall to keep the winter out, but a hearth warm enough to welcome everyone in.